Radio presents The Truth Denied Talk Radio with your host, Roxy Lopez, where truth never lies. If you would like to speak with Roxy on the air, the call-in number is 347-327-9997. Here she is, your host, Roxy Lopez.
Welcome to The Truth Denied Radio. I'll be your host, Roxy Lopez. Today is Friday, the 18th of November, and we have a very special guest for you today. I know that a lot of you have been writing in about Marc McCandlish. Marc is just an absolutely amazing encyclopedia, if you will. And you all know it. I know that you really look forward. You had a lot of questions for Marc today, and we will get to those questions. Marc doesn't even need an introduction at this point. He is family to the Truth Denied Talk Radio. So without any further ado, let's just bring Marc McCandlish on. Welcome to the show, Marc.
Thank you, Roxy. Appreciate you having me back.
Absolutely. Now, Marc, you know, we've been inside of some discussions, and for the listening audience, let's just start right at the beginning here with your observation of what's going on in the skies. What is a chemtrail? What is geoengineering all about? What is your understanding at this point?
Well, chemtrails, for anyone who hasn't actually noticed what's going on in the skies, are these trails being left by jet aircraft flying at altitude that stretch from horizon to horizon and persist for hours, in most cases spreading out and eventually becoming either a white haze or contributing to the formation of clouds. They're distinguished from conventional condensation trails, or contrails as they're more commonly called, which are nothing more than moisture condensing on the hot exhaust gases from the jet engines as they fly at altitude. Now, this is sort of an industrial scale version of what happens when you're out on a cold day and you exhale and you see your breath. It's the same kind of process where the temperature difference between the air that you're exhaling from your lungs is much warmer than the cold, moist air around you. And so the water, the moisture, the humidity in the air condenses because of the hot gases, or the relatively warmer gases that come out of your lungs. Of course, the jet engine produces much higher temperatures, somewhere around 1,500 degrees, I guess. So when you see a conventional contrail, it usually is, probably 20 times the length of the aircraft that's producing it, sometimes a little bit longer. An aircraft flying at altitude, if you were to look up and put your hand out at arm's length and sort of measure the length of a conventional contrail for an aircraft that's flying, say, at 20 to 25,000 feet, would probably be 5 to 6 inches in length on a ruler held at arm's length. But the chemtrails involve the dispensing of microscopically fine, evenly sized nuclei, little tiny particles, in many cases of three different kinds of metals that we see more commonly than anything else. So the first and foremost is aluminum oxide. Second is, I believe it's barium. And the third one that we see in the least amount of quantities among the three is strontium. Now, there are some isotopes of barium and strontium that have a certain amount of radioactivity, but it doesn't appear that these particular particles have really any seriously measurable level of radioactivity. But they do have a certain level of reactivity with the moisture in the atmosphere. and that is that's the main issue, is what it does when it's in the air. You put a number in the billions of particles into the atmosphere, and you produce them, distribute them into the environment at a higher temperature, and of course they attract the humidity in the environment, and they condense, and they begin to form ice crystals or condensation into water droplets. It accelerates the process of condensation. So it's very much like cloud seeding, but there's an eventually situation where these materials will ordinarily fall out, either with the precipitation that's formed and eventually becomes a cloud or storms, or there are other things that can be done to continue to keep those particles aloft, one of which is a series of patents that have been found that talk about a particular kind of polymer material that's mixed in with these fluids that are dispensed out of the aircraft, either through the jet exhaust or from the wings, that actually absorb the solar radiation from the heat of the sun, and they're able to, basically they're self-lofting materials that will allow this polymer to stay up in the upper areas of the atmosphere for days, weeks, and in some cases the claims have been for up to a year. So these materials, once they're put in the atmosphere, are obviously going to have some kind of an effect. First and foremost appears to be an impact on the amount of solar radiation that reaches the surface. If you can reflect that away from the surface, if you can control the degree of solar radiation that reaches the surface, you can not only control how much sunlight an area will get, you can control the temperatures of the geology in that area. You can even control how much sunlight a crop is receiving from the sun. And so in so doing, you can alter the temperature of the environment. And, of course, everybody who's ever really looked at weather and what happens with weather knows that if you have a relatively cold environment, that the air isn't as excited because there's as much heat, so the air tends to contract, and that contraction can basically pull more air into that area. You can actually sequentially seed areas or blanket areas with chemtrails and actually divert the course of the jet stream, which is one of the primary moving forces both in the north and the southern hemispheres for major weather patterns. And if you can do that, then you can divert the course of storms. And if you can control the course of storms, then of course you can actually influence where precipitation falls or where it does not fall, and you can have some serious impacts across the entire face of the planet.
Which we're probably seeing right now.
Well, it sure looks that way. I mean, I live up here in Northern California in the community of Redding, which is about a little over 2 hours by car north of Sacramento. And just in the last week, we had one day where from the crack of dawn, between 7 and 9 a.m., there were literally hundreds of chemtrails that were being dispensed over this area. And this seemed to be right in the area ahead of an incoming storm front that was coming down out of the Gulf of Alaska. And in fact, this is probably the tail end of the storm that you and I are going to talk about a little bit later, that actually had an effect on one of your family members, who was up on a fishing boat in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Now, how long do you think that this program has been going on, geoengineering and aerosol spraying? I mean, in your best estimation, how long do you think that we've been actually been having this impact?
Well, there've been studies that were conducted all the way back in the 1950s, 1960s about the possibility of seeding clouds by putting silver iodide and other kinds of materials into the clouds. The idea that you can actually make a change to the environment by putting certain materials into the air has been known for quite some time. I mean, they've even found that by seeding the oceans with fine particulate of iron, that they can dramatically boost the production of algae, so essentially fertilization of the oceans. And that algae then in turn will produce tremendous amounts of oxygen because, they're like microscopically sized plants, so they take in carbon dioxide and they're producing oxygen in exchange during that process. So it's one way that's been looked at doing things like what you hear more often now is carbon dioxide sequestration. So, they've known for quite some time that you could do this, but if you get up on the internet and you begin looking at all of the different research and the studies and the peer-reviewed papers that have been published that describe some of the processes that we now see actively being undertaken in the air over our heads, you'll find that not only were major corporations looking at ways to do this, but even the military has explored what the consequences would be health-wise to people who were exposed to nanoparticle materials. Now, the significance of nanoparticles is that if you can take a material such as aluminum oxide, which has one atom of aluminum and three atoms of oxygen, and you take that material and you are able to produce it in large quantities, that would be one thing. But being able to control the actual size of the particles down to a very specific dimension, say 40 to 100 nanometers across, that is a significant development that has been seeing great strides in advancement over the last decade or so. And now there are a number of companies around the world that are producing millions of tons of this all the time. If you look at the stock market and how these particular areas of technology are seeing greater and greater levels of investment in the billions of dollars, you can see that the production levels of this are going up. And it's not just because they're using it to produce explosives, and you'll find that this material, if you look up, say, thermate or thermite, super thermite explosives, the kinds of explosives that are used in the controlled demolition of buildings and in high explosive materials used by the military, you'll find that these materials are used, the same kinds of materials that are used in chemtrailing. Now, the reason that is significant is because just like these, just in the last month or so, there's been at least one major grain silo explosion where people were actually killed or injured. And you may not understand the link between those two things, but what happens is when you have something that is combustible, and aluminum oxide is something that contributes greatly to a combustion process because it introduces so much oxygen to the chemical reaction. But if you take something like grain dust that's evenly distributed through the atmosphere, it's a fine particle, it's combustible. If there's any kind of a spark or an ignition that occurs, because of the fine particulation of the material, the combustion reaction spreads through the environment much faster than it ordinarily would. And so this is what causes the explosion. It's basically like a flame front that rips through the inside of the combustion chamber of your car's engine, except on a much, much larger scale. And of course, it can completely blow the buildings apart. And this is what has happened, is what killed these people. But if you take that same kind of material and you introduce it into jet fuel, now, and there's actually been studies done where they were using up to 40% by weight in the jet fuel for some of these jet aircraft that are flying at altitude, that the aluminum oxide introduces so much oxygen into the reaction that it not only enhances the combustion process, it raises the temperatures, but because of its fine size, its fine particulate size, there's no erosion of the turbine blades in the compressor section or the combustion section of the jet engines, but it speeds up the combustion reaction, makes it more efficient, so you get higher efficiency, more thrust from the jet engine, and so you get your fuel costs are reduced because 40% of what you're actually burning is a solid aluminum oxide material, albeit very, very fine particulation. So, this is one of the things that may be responsible for, the chemtrails, is the fact that they're looking for ways to fly these aircraft more economically. And in my area, I went out and bought a very large set of binoculars from a sporting goods store, the 80 by 20, I think they are. And, you can see that many of the planes that are laying down these chemtrails are actually painted in the livery of a number of airlines, and most particularly here in this area is Southwest Airlines, sort of an orange, red, and blue paint scheme with these stripes and things that go down the plane. But I've also seen, on several occasions, the 747 laying down chemtrails. It was sprayed in the blue over white livery of KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. So, it appears at least that if these are not actually commercial airliners, that many of the aircraft that are dispensing these chemtrails are painted to look as though they are commercial airliners. But I think the main thing that I want to point out was that the aluminum oxide, when it comes out of the exhaust, it goes into the environment, and when it gets into the environment, it either stays there, depending on how much of these other lofting polymers are included in the exhaust stream, that contribute to keeping these particles airborne as long as possible, or they begin to settle out in this form of a kind of a white haze. In our area, when I first moved up here in the early 1990s, you could look 60, 70 miles away and see Mount Lassen as clear as a bell with a beautiful blue sky. But starting around 2000 or 2001, I began to notice these trails overhead that would persist for hours, and then in the wake of those trails having been dispensed, that you would begin to see this white haze that would settle over the area. Now, that's really kind of separate and apart, distinguished from the kind of air pollution that you would see like in the Phoenix or Los Angeles area or Mexico City or Rome, places like that where you have a tremendous volume of car exhaust that's producing kind of a brownish gray smog. This is a pure white haze, and it's not the kind of thing that you see because of added humidity. When you see higher humidity in the air, it tends to be kind of a bluish haze, a bluish gray. But this is obviously something different. It's something that's being put into the environment, and it's showing up in the water. It's showing up in the water analysis that has been done by a number of people up here in Northern California. They're seeing a dramatic change in the alkalinity of the soil. We're seeing a die-off of the invertebrates in the streams and the lakes that support the fish population, so we're seeing a reduction in the fish, the number of fish. We've seen a dramatic drop in the number of amphibians. One of the things that you typically find in Northern California are what they call vernal or seasonal ponds, with everything from mosquito larvae to fairy shrimp, which is a protected species, but also tremendous populations of tree frogs and other kinds of amphibians. And these populations have been absolutely devastated. And it appears that this has a lot to do with the aluminum oxide, barium, and strontium fallout that's coming from the chemtrails.
Now, Marc, what's your opinion on, secret biological chemicals being tested on the public? Is that even possible? Or, in other words, what is the agenda for the aerosol spraying?
Well, I'm sure that it's possible to make a connection between one and the other. I mean, you can come to the conclusion that this may be a form of biological warfare. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are chemical and biological warfare statutes that are on the books and have been for decades under Title 50 United States Code. I think it's Section 1512, if I'm not mistaken, that essentially says that in any instance where intentionally or unintentionally chemicals or biological weapons of any kind, whether it's some kind of germ warfare or something that affects the biology of the environment or the people living there, that the Department of Health and Human Services for the United States government needs to be given advance notice, as do the governors of each of the individual states where these kinds of things are going on. So they're as long as it's something that's being perpetrated by the government itself or one of their government or defense contractors that are under government contract, there has to be a paper trail. There has to be acknowledgement, something that can be found under the Freedom of Information Act. But I haven't seen any evidence that there is an acknowledgement of what's going on. And this is what's so disturbing, because it actually seems to be something that's being perpetrated by corporations in specific areas. We've had discussions in the past about some of the aircraft that appear to be flying out of bases or airports that are operated by a particular company with a name that refers to a particular kind of conifer, and it's the kind of thing that really makes you wonder to see something that has been perpetrated on the kind of scale that we're talking about here has to involve billions upon billions of dollars, not only in the investment of equipment, the modification of aircraft, recruiting the pilots that are going to fly these things, and then establishing some kind of a system worldwide that would allow for the control and dispensing of these materials in particular areas. This last week, when these hundreds of chemtrails were being dispensed here in Northern California, I happened to exchange some emails with some folks that live down in the Angeles Mountains, north and east of Los Angeles, and they informed me that they were seeing the exact same kind of activity down there as well. So, in fact, a year ago and 2 years ago, when we were seeing all of the storms in the central United States that were dumping these tremendous amounts of precipitation causing flooding, all of those storms were heavily seeded before they passed across the Pacific coast and went inland. And I predicted in my own mind, just by watching what was happening over my head, that there were going to be some terrible storms that were going to hit the central United States, and in fact, that's what happened. And so it showed me that to a certain degree, even for me, someone who's just a casual observer, I could look at the weather satellite loops and video loops and the day-by-day photography of what was happening with the clouds, that it seemed pretty obvious that someone not only was seeding these clouds and steering the course of these storms in such a way that they would dump a tremendous amount of precipitation, starting on the east side of the Rocky Mountains and moving eastward up through the central United States. So if you can do that, if you can predict that, if you can control where it goes, then you can have an impact on a geographical region. You can have an impact on the agriculture there, the people there, property, all kinds of things. You can essentially be responsible for life and death. People don't usually go through these kinds of catastrophes without loss of life and loss of property. So in terms of there being an impact biologically or physically on the environment, yes, I think it's something that can be done. It can be predicted.
Absolutely. One of my questions is, you mentioned earlier that billions and billions of dollars are going into these types of programs and corporations are spending billions of dollars on the components to this, I guess, and like you said, for fittings of aircraft or purchases of aircraft. So would it be corporations that are responsible for the spraying, or is the military involved at all? And if so, where is the money coming from to sustain this type of adventure, if you will?
Well, if you look at the TARP funds, for example, one of the major companies that received billions of dollars was the AIG insurance company. And if you follow the money through AIG, you find that they're the company that seems to be the spigot, the control valve for many of the Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund sites. They're one of the major conveyors of funds for a Superfund site that exists right here in Redding, called the Iron Mountain Mine. I happen to know Ted Arman, the billionaire who owns that mine, and it's very clear in talking to him that a lot of what's happening, where these taxpayer dollars are going to bail out these companies, it's in part because this money is sort of disappearing into this network of corporations that all link back to these different areas of research and what appear to be active programs for dispensing these kinds of materials.
Marc, this is like alarming, but there's another component to it as well, and we've sort of hinted about it before, and we've had many discussions, you and I, about it. Michael Murphy has just recently released a promo for a documentary that they're doing called "Why in the World Are They Spraying?" You know,
this
sequel.
Is a sequel to his first film, "What in the World Are They Spraying?"
Correct. And I think that Michael has his sights on exactly what you're talking about with the corporations, and he's actually described to a T the direction that this is being taken now. In other words, if you own the weather, or you have a way to own the weather and control the weather, as you so described, and the next step would be, if you know what the weather's going to be, you could actually start making bets on the stock market. I know I'm wrapping that into a tight little box there that's hard to understand, but Michael Murphy can explain that much better than I can, and I'm thinking that we should get Michael on the line here. We should just
absolutely agree.
We should get Mike Murphy on the line and see if he can expand a little bit for us. Because when I went Hello?
Our call was dropped. We're fine, Roxy. You're on the air.
Okay. Marc, can you hear me? Marc McCandlish, are you still there?
I don't know if he's answered the phone yet. I don't think he might realize that we got disconnected from Skype.
Okay. We're getting
everybody back on.
We're getting everybody back on. We've all been disconnected from the network. This happens. By the way, just to let you guys know, there was an event scheduled for this show, and it was scheduled for 12 to 2. And somebody changed the event to 1 to... Hi, Marc. We all got disconnected from the network.
Well, are we still on the air?
Now we are. We're back on the air, yes. And now we're going to attempt...
Calling Michael now.
We're calling... Thank you. We're now calling Michael Murphy. Sorry about the interruption, people. It happens.
This is Mike.
Mike Murphy. This is Roxy Lopez from the Truth Denied Talk Radio. How are you?
Hey, how you doing, Roxy?
I'm doing great. You know, we're live on the air, just to let you know. and we are speaking with Marc McCandlish, and we've got ourselves into a little bit of a corner here in talking about derivatives and such, and then I realized that, you have the promo that just came out, Why in the World Are They Spraying? And we decided to give you a call. And by the way, when we mentioned that we're going to give you a call and had the engineer give you a call, we all got disconnected from the show.
You did. Well,
yes,
I was listening for a little bit, but then I had a phone call come in, so what a pleasant surprise.
All right on. And so thanks. Do you have a little bit of time to hang out with us and explain a few things?
Only for you, Roxy, and if Marc's on, I'd be honored to come on and speak a moment in the likes of you, so of course.
Oh, right, great. Well, where we we're speaking on the idea of the corporations who are spending billions of dollars on aerosol spraying. And then I asked Marc, well, where are they getting all this money from? And there's a number of ways. Marc did if you've been listening, Marc's done a great job of explaining, how some of this works. Can you add the component that you've recently discovered, and even while you're at it, maybe speak a little bit about the conference that you went to as well, and some of your promo, and where are you going with that?
Absolutely, and in the new promo that I'll speak about can be found on truthmediaproductions.us. And it's a YouTube clip. And since we released What in the World Are They Spraying, people have been saying, well, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? And it's not a real simple answer, because I call these multi-agenda operations. As you know, there's not one simple answer to this. It's almost like the people who are orchestrating this are bowling. They're knocking down a whole bunch of pins every time they spray. But after talking with a lot of different meteorologists, who have made it very clear to me that geoengineering programs are, in fact, in part, weather control, I decided to go to an aerosol conference, the American Association for Aerosol Research, and that was in Orlando a couple weeks ago. And after I left, I pretty much, left with what I thought I would learn. I did learn that atmospheric aerosols do have an impact on clouds and precipitation, and without a doubt can be used to make it rain in certain areas and create less rain in certain areas. Now, during that conference, I had an opportunity to speak with a NASA scientist, which is on the new film, Why in the World Are They Spraying? But I spoke with a number of other scientists, all who have noticed an increase in atmospheric aerosols in the past 10 years. This note was also studied by NOAA, who wrote an article, and we put that in the video as well, that yes, there has been a significant release of atmospheric aerosols. They have failed to A, sort what the aerosols are, and B, they have failed to identify a source as to where these aerosols are coming from. Obviously, we know where they're coming from, but the whole gist of that meeting was, without a doubt, and I have the NASA scientists talking about this, geoengineering programs could be used to corporatize our weather. So we know that our weather has been very erratic. That is without question. We also have seen it snow well above 32 degrees. There are numerous patents for ice nucleation above freezing temperatures. Those can be used to create snowstorms. Why would they want to do that? A lot of different theories, perhaps one to actually reflect more sunlight up. We do know, and I'm kind of data dumping on you, Roxy, but we do know that our ozone has been shredded. There's a lot of documentation on that. I believe I put that in the video as well. So maybe they're creating snowstorms to reflect some of the radiation that's coming into the earth. But we generally don't view these programs as something that is in the best interest of the general public. Typically, when we see programs such as this go out, it's really to consolidate power. And what I've learned, weather control as geoengineer David Keith stated about a year ago. He said, geoengineering gives man godlike power. And I realized there are many different motives for controlling the weather. And I went to Chicago, and I had met a trader at the Mercantile Exchange, and I had just learned that weather is now being traded as a commodity on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So I sat down and I spoke with him, and in all fairness, it's a rather small commodity for the volumes that they trade. It's about 10 million, but I did talk to him, and I said, well, could certain corporations benefit by controlling the weather? And he said, absolutely. He said, weather is traded as a derivative. So if you're an insurance company and you have a crop, let's say in Texas this summer, and if you knew that a drought was going to be created, and I want to touch upon that, and let's say you had $1 billion worth of crops or $1 billion worth of crops, but your insurance was $10 million, and you knew there was going to be a drought, he said, absolutely. So people could benefit from this. So like anything, I think a few years ago, and probably most people believe that our weather is natural and unpredictable, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. We do know there is an agenda owning the weather in 2025. It's a stated goal of our military. And Roxy, I think that they have more control than most people realize. So essentially, do people benefit from it? Absolutely. They benefit from it in a number of different ways, but there are also corporations that benefit from disasters in many different ways. And let's look at the floods in the Midwest.
Okay.
Who benefited from that? Well, what we saw levees, dams that were broken. We saw farm fields flooded, and as a result, many farmers lost their crops. So it's rumored, and I have to look at this, that I believe it was Murdoch's company that actually came in and bought farmland up pennies on the dollar. And then guess what? They go in, they replant with these GMO, Monsanto or other genetically modified seeds. So there is definitely an incentive, a corporate incentive, and let's look what happened down in Texas. We know Texas has had, I guess, different political views than that of the globalists, and ironically, they had a drought this summer. And if you go to the store today and buy beef, you'll realize it's much higher than it was just a couple of months ago. And what had happened again, many farmers were unable to grow food, so they had to sell their cattle off early, which really increased the price. So we know Henry Kissinger a number of years ago stated in 2010 they were going to start using food as a weapon. We see food prices rising as a result, not only here in the U.S., many are now very hungry, but especially overseas, we see an increase in the amount of people who are dying from starvation. So we know that that's the stated goal. But let's, again, look who benefits from this: multinational corporations, people who can hedge their bets and predict the weather. There's no question about that. And then the GMO seed companies. And we also covered weather is a very effective weapon of war. Iran's president, Ahmadinejad, recently came out and he said that Western countries were using weather technology to create droughts in this area. And what it can do if you're a globalist and you want to create global governance and you have certain countries that want to hold on to the resources and don't want to give up their sovereignty, well, God, if you control the weather, you can literally bring that country down to its knees, and they will be begging for drought-resistant seeds. They will be begging for rain. They will be begging for water, and they will gladly give up the resources for it. So that's unfortunately what we're seeing. There, without question, are many different financial motives, there are many different corporate motives, and there are many different political motives associated with controlling the weather. So again, weather control gives man godlike power. There are many different motives, and unfortunately, it's at the expense of all of us, because what it is, we know that aluminum oxide appears to be the primary ingredient in the chemtrail geoengineering programs. Of course, geoengineers proposed spraying 10 to 20 million tons of toxic aluminum into our skies. It's now reported that John Holdren, who is Obama's science czar, has now admitted spraying aluminum, barium, and other things into our skies, stating it was just in the testing. But why aluminum? Well, if you look at aluminum, it's not a real good conductor, let's say, in our wire around our home, but it's a very effective conductor in the sky. And I've spoken to a number of people about this, and even geoengineers. And geoengineers boast about their ability to heat up over 400 square miles of our atmosphere. Roxy, why would they want to do this?
That's my question, too. Exactly. That's my question.
We're trying to block the sun, but at the same time, we're going to heat up the atmosphere. No, something doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, there's probably a different agenda. Well, if you heat up the atmosphere, and I'm sure that Marc can touch on this as well, you can actually lift up the atmosphere, creating high-pressure systems and low-pressure systems, and you can steer storms. So we have that ability, and then you take the different aerosols that they're putting up there, and from the Aerosol Research Conference and a number of other documents, we do know that they have the ability to sequester moisture and make it rain in some areas. So without a doubt, they have the ability, the technology, in the motive to do this. It is happening. It really is.
And thanks for that, Michael. Thanks for the work that you do, by the way, because millions of people are waking up to the fact that there is some type of aerosol program or programs going on throughout the world. We know that it's global. We know that it's impacting the planet negatively, and every life source on the planet is getting negatively impacted by this. And it is very convoluted. At the one side of the coin, you've got this whole global warming aspect that came up with Al Gore's campaign. He's the poster child for that. And then you've got covering up of, like you say, the sun. And by the way, we're having just massive spraying here in Arizona today, and I do have a lot of photos. I'm going to send Marc some photos of some airplanes. I mean, Marc had mentioned earlier on the show that in the last couple of weeks, hundreds and hundreds, starting at the crack of dawn. We're having it going on day and night at this point. I'm not sure what happened. But I did want to ask that there's a gentleman who wrote in, Richard Graham, and he had a question, and I can throw it out to both of you. He says, does anyone else besides me think that the people involved in weather manipulation programs have blood on their hands, and now that it has gone this far, there is no turning back?
Well, I can jump in on that one if you like, Roxy.
Thank you, Marc.
Well, I don't think there's any question that there's blood on their hands. I mean, if you look at the tremendous storm system that hit Joplin, Missouri last year and killed all those people. If you look at all the flooding and the deaths, I mean, if you consider the death of entire herds of cattle because of flooding, yes, that's blood on the hands. If you talk about the people who are killed in these superstorms that seem to come roaring up out of the Gulf of Mexico and things like that, things that have been augmented and steered using these geoengineering techniques, I don't think there's any doubt that if you could point the finger at a particular corporation and say they were the ones that helped to augment that storm, that essentially, yes, you're talking about murder. And honestly, I think that if you could show a cause and effect, that these planes flying under these bureau numbers, dispensing these materials made by these manufacturers that were piloted and operated by a particular corporation that was intentionally set up to augment and steer the course of a storm that culminated in the loss of property and the deaths of individuals, that not only could you take this to the Securities and Exchange Commission because of the put offers that are being made against the companies that insure against the losses and the claims that are filed because of the consequences of the storm, but you could also file murder charges through the Department of Justice. And frankly, I think eventually, when there's enough awareness has been raised about the situation, that this is what may ultimately happen. I hear people on the radio all the time categorically denying that this is possible, categorically denying that chemtrails are a reality, that such things are even possible, and yet I have dozens of scientific papers that I've been able to find right on the internet that not only talk about the toxicological effects of aluminum oxide on the white blood cells in your body that are part of your immune system. It tremendously impairs their ability to engulf pathogens in your system if you breathe this stuff into your lungs. They've proven it in the environment. It was an Air Force study that was started in 1993, and it terminated right about the time the chemtrails really kicked up and started, becoming more obvious on a day-to-day basis. So I don't think there's any doubt that there's blood on their hands. There's no question about it in my mind.
And Mike Murphy, can you answer to the other half of that question that Richard Graham asked? Is there no turning back?
Well, if you look at these people, and they are typically sociopaths, they have a planned agenda. And Roxy, I often hear, and I get the question every time we do a screening of the film, or oftentimes people call in, they say, well, aren't the people who are orchestrating this breathing in the same air that we are? And there are two people involved in this. There are the pilots, the people involved who are probably compartmentalized, who might not even be aware of what they're doing, but there's definitely, a select group of people who know very well what they are doing. And we have to look at it like this. Power is geoengineering. Again, David Keith said geoengineering gives man godlike power. Now, I've never chased it. I know that you haven't chased it. I know that Marc hasn't chased it. Very few of our listeners have chased it, but there are people that go after that, and it must be one hell of a rush. And I often relate to it as an addiction. And many of us have perhaps had family members or friends who became dependent on drugs that not only put their health at risk, but their family members' health at risk in order to get the rush of the drug. How much greater of a rush is godlike power? And the reason I bring that up, I think there's a comparison. These people want this power. They want to bring about this global governance. And what they're doing, they're corporatizing natural systems. Similar to our GMO seed market, they've taken natural organic foods, they've genetically modified it. Why? Well, at one time, all of the food supply was under the authority of nature and or our creator. They've genetically modified it. Now it is under the authority and control of this corporate governmental conglomerate that I call the beast. And many religions prophesy about this. So that the weather control is this very same principle. What they're doing, they're actually usurping the authority of nature so that men and people can have this godlike power. And I don't think because of that, because of the rush involved and because of this addiction to power, I think these programs are locked into place, and I think they continue moving forward with them. However, I do know the power of the spoken word, and I do know the power of the human spirit. And if everybody who is aware of this stood up and said no, the man or the people behind the curtain could not continue on with this. And that's why I'm so adamant about getting this message out. We do have power. We do have the ability to stop this. So the ball's really in our court. Do they plan on stopping? Absolutely not. Are we going to let them continue? And my answer is absolutely not. So they have to stop. And we will get these programs stopped. But we need more people involved.
Exactly. And speaking about getting more people involved, what are some of the ways that Michael, that you get people involved in the message or waking them up. I know the obvious, which is what in the world are they spraying? I mean, that really had a huge impact on a lot of people's lives. And, of course, now you're continuing on with the why in the world are they spraying, because the question came up so much. But what are some of the ways that you have developed to continue on with this awareness campaign? What are some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah, good question. I use many different tactics. Like yesterday, typically on heavier spray days, I'll burn DVDs and go out and hand them out. I'll go out into the public, and I think that's a very effective way if it's done in the right spirit. And I've been very successful. My entire neighborhood is aware of these programs, and many of them are becoming active and handing out DVDs as well. But, I get active through the social networking, through Facebook and other media outlets, and I put my work as well as some of the new developments out there into the public, so it stays fresh on their mind. But there are many different things that we can do. I've also started a chemtrails outreach group here in Los Angeles, and we have huge banners where we typically go over the freeway, the 405, which gets hundreds of thousands of cars, many of which we found out was in support of what we were doing. So the banners say chemtrails, geoengineering equals crimes against humanity, or we have another one if they're spraying us, look up, they're spraying us, Google chemtrails, geoengineering. So getting out into the public, I think, is absolutely essential, because anytime you have an issue, for it to get addressed politically, you do need public support with it. So we're definitely getting there. And I've also, as you know, I've been very active in Hawaii. And because we've been effective in holding symposiums and handing out free DVDs, we do have critical mass there. And there is a demand for a ban on geoengineering above the island of Maui. So because there's so much public support, we now have political support, and we're in the process of writing what's called the Clean Sky Ordinance, which will ban geoengineering programs on and around the county of Maui. So we have a sponsor from the government who's going to sponsor this bill, and we're also in the process of writing one for Kauai. What we're hoping to do is get every island, which is separated, as you know, by counties, to pass similar ordinances and then bring it to the state level. And that's a very effective thing. But I think, initially what we have to do, and I've really found that addressing this more so at the local level is more effective. There's less of a chance that our local politicians are going to be sold out to the globalist agenda. But once you get up to Congress and members of Senate, that's where we typically see greater challenge. Not that we shouldn't put pressure on those politicians, but I can't stress the importance of addressing this more at the local level, at the village level, the county level, and we're getting there. It's all about awareness. So, and again, we're encouraging people who purchase a DVD to make copies and hand out for free. So I know I plugged the website. My new video, Why in the World Are They Spraying, can be found at truthmediaproductions.us. And we also have activism shirts and other tools so that you can get out into your community.
And thank you. And for all of the followers of the Truth Denied, we also have Why in the World Are They Spraying on the front of the website, and we also have some more information that you've written up on your visit to the Geoengineering conference, and of course we will always have available what in the world are they spraying, and again, we really appreciate your work. And Marc, did you have anything that you wanted to add to what Michael was saying? I think that we might have caught Michael off guard, and I'm having a feeling that he might have to leave soon.
Well, first and foremost, I just want to express my sincere appreciation to Michael for all of his efforts. He was actually up here, I guess it was last year, producing, or I should say presenting, a showing of what in the world are they spraying before an audience in one of the local schools in the auditorium there. and we met through a friend of mine, Dane Wigington, who's also been very active here in Northern California in trying to raise public awareness of the chemtrail issue. I have to tell you that I'm blown away by the amount of research that he's done with his co-producer, G. Edward Griffin, and the amount of exposure that both these gentlemen have given this particular subject on the Internet has been phenomenal. And I just truly admire the efforts that he and they have made.
Well, thanks, Marc, and please, I mean, you have been very instrumental in educating me as well as many other people. So for the first time, we have a core group of people who are really working hard, and we have made a difference. You know, we collectively had. So it's interesting because there's a synergy that's happening. It's spreading out to other people, and it's, you know, many things to your work and also to Roxy. I know Roxy works, I think, 7 days a week, Roxy, at getting the work, maybe even 8 days a week. I know she's definitely committed on this, and that's what it's going to take. But before I leave, because I do have to get going, I can't stress, we have probably the greatest crisis in history that's on our hands. We have human health implications and ecological implications that are unquantifiable. And I cannot stress the importance of getting out there, getting active, and addressing this. Because if we don't, we're looking at some real serious consequences in the future. And the message was never a message of fear, and it can't be a fear, but it has to be one of faith that, yes, we can collectively stand up and get these damaging programs stopped. I do not want to live in a world that's controlled by these vipers. I do not want to live in a world where I will not be able to eat natural organic foods without bowing down to them. No, I have freedom. We all do as human beings, and we have to exercise it. So,
thank you, Michael. And before you take off, you're going to be visiting Phoenix, Arizona soon. Are you not?
I am going to be visiting Phoenix, Arizona, and you must promise me that we will get together for lunch at least, yes, or perhaps do some media stuff. But yes, you obviously wanted me to elaborate on that.
Yes.
I will be in Phoenix, and we will be screening What in the World Are They Spraying and doing a question and answer. In Mesa, I do not have a location yet.
Well, when you get that location, we'll definitely let people know about it. We'll publicize that on the front of the Truth Denied website, and so don't worry about it. Just pop me an email when you do get an address. But that's going to be awesome. I'd really like to make it to that screening as well. And you definitely, you and I are definitely hooking up. If for those who are listening, Michael and I keep crossing paths over the last year. It's not even funny. We were both on the Big Island at the same time when my sister was dying of cancer, and God bless her, she did pass away, and she's in a better place now. But and I was going to be at a screening. Remember that in Hilo, Michael? And then that didn't take place because I never got there in time for it, and I had to reschedule all it. And then we were going to meet up in Maui, and then that never happened. And you know what? Three's a charm. So we were definitely meeting up this time in Phoenix, Arizona.
I will make sure of that, and it will be my pleasure. But thank you again for all that both you and Marc are doing, and then all of the listeners, because I know that a number of the listeners have been active as well. So I want to thank each and every one of you for working with all of us. We're all part of the same movement. God bless you, and have a great weekend. And again, thanks for calling me, and thanks again for having me on. I really appreciate that, and it's an honor to be on with both of you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much. So
okay.
There we have. Yeah, you have a great day. You have a great weekend too. I'm sure we'll catch up with you. So there you have it. That was Michael Murphy. Again, if you want to see what his new frontier is at this point, or additional frontier, please check out the promo, Why in the World Are They Spraying? It's very in-depth, and at the same time, it's the tip of the iceberg. I think that Michael is really onto something, don't you, Marc?
Oh, I sure do. I think that it's important to sort of follow up on what he was saying about raising public awareness. Mm-hmm. You and I had talked about putting together kind of a master copy, a letter that your listeners can download from the website that they can then send to their local political representatives, letting these people know that we object to what's happening. I, of course, have sent you copies of the various research papers that I found, like the Air Force study that was done by the I think it was the Department for Human Efficiency at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I think it was called In Vitro Toxicology of Aluminum Oxide Nanoparticles in Rat Alveolar Macrophages. That basically is just a fancy way of saying the study of what happens to white blood cells, part of the immune system, in the alveoli. These are little air sacs in the lungs of rats. We all have, if you have lungs, you have alveoli. They're the little air sacs that expand and contract inside your lungs every time you inhale and you exhale. And there are white blood cells in that area that help to ward off any kind of pathogens, germs, or toxic materials that wind up being inhaled while you breathe. And when these white blood cells in your lungs are exposed to aluminum oxide in particular, it suppresses their ability to perform something called phagocytosis. White blood cells are an awful lot like an amoeba. They have sort of a loosely defined boundary area around them. They can swim up to a germ and they can basically engulf it and swim around it and close it up and basically digest it like an amoeba. And that's what the phagocytosis process is the engulfing of the pathogen. But aluminum oxide nanoparticles actually suppress the ability of the white blood cells to do this. So you can see very clearly that this is something that will impair your body's ability to fight off infections. So if then, as part of the chemtrail spraying program, you start introducing pathogens into the environment, there seems to be some indication that this disorder that's referred to as Morgellons disease is showing up in populations that are seeing a lot of chemtrail activity. So, it's a very insidious kind of spooky, aspect to this whole program, because if you can go into an area and you can suppress the immune system of the population there, and then also through the seeding operations of chemtrails, distribute a particular kind of pathogen into an area, you can over time infect a population with diseases that may culminate in their death without any kind of damage to the infrastructure, without any denial of the geography, particularly if you have the antidote to whatever those pathogens happens to be. Or, in many cases, we now know that they have the ability to genetically modify germs and organisms like this, make them much more susceptible to a particular kind of material that could also be dispensed in chemtrails to essentially sterilize an area of a pathogen that was previously seeded into an area. There's a wonderful video up on the TED, the TED lecture site by Bonnie Bassler that talks about quorum sensing in bacteria and microorganisms. And they've found that germs that are in your system will basically float around, and not become virulent. They will not begin to attack your body until there's enough of them as they divide. One cell becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16, and things like that. And, these populations of bacteria have, over the billions of years, have developed a kind of chemical messaging system where they produce a chemical, and the root basis, the chemical root of this particular substance is pretty much universal throughout the germ world, and that each particular species has little tags that they put on the end of this particular chemical message that will identify which species they are and how many of them there are by the sheer numbers. And the outside of each cell has receptors for these chemical messengers. And so by being able to determine whether the population within the host has reached a specific level is determined by the amount of these chemical messengers flowing around your system. And so this is the quorum sensing, like a quorum of priests or so, in a church or something. Quorum sensing is a way in which a population of bacteria in your body can determine that they have enough members in their population to then go forward and attack the host and become virulent and begin to cause a disease process to really kick off in earnest. And so if you have a close examination under electron scanning microscope of these receptors and the chemical messaging system that these bacteria employ, one of the things that Bonnie Bassel even talks about in this lecture is that these receptors can be fooled with inert chemicals that would then prevent these germs from going into their virulent state. So let's imagine then that you have a way of dispensing a chemical in the environment through the air that gets inhaled into the lungs of every person living in that populated area. And you can use these chemicals to suppress the virulence of any kind of population of bacteria that exists in the bodies of these people. At the same time, seed the area with multiple strains of bacteria which are being held in kind of an inert state by an onboard chemical messenger. Now, let's say you oversaturate a population with all these different strains of bacteria, which, if they became virulent, could wipe out the population in a matter of weeks. And then, after you've done this, you then seed the population again through the aerosol process, where you can lay down that one final messenger, the chemical messenger that says, okay, now's the time to attack. It's something that's universally messaging every one of the strains of bacteria that have been distributed into the populated area in advance. And you could see how, without dropping a single bomb, without causing a single weather catastrophe or anything like that you could suddenly create a disease process in a targeted population that could wipe them out, and do it so quickly that there wouldn't be any way that the Center for Disease Control or the World Health Organization, there would not be any way of going in and reversing the process, because no one would have a clue how it started in the first place.
Right.
It's insidious.
Absolutely. You're describing the movie Contagion, actually.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, you are. You're actually describing the movie, and it was astounding how relative the movie, how accurate it was as to giving, like, all the players away as well, like who starts this, how it gets started, and very similar to what you just explained. And, Marc, I just want to let you know, earlier in the show today, I was given a message by the engineer that today this show has broken the GIC radio. It's a record breaker for the chat room and how many live listeners. So we have broken the GIC radio record today.
Well, that's wonderful.
So you just happen to be on that, and you win a prize.
Well, I hope it's something good. Free dinner at the Olive Garden or something.
Okay. Well, maybe you can come down here when Michael Murphy's here. But I will say also, we also have callers on the line.
Okay.
And are you ready to take a couple of questions as we continue our conversation?
Of course. Let me just say in advance that over the last couple of I think there's been 2 previous times that you and I have had occasion to talk. Mm-hmm. And I've actually received an awful lot of very complimentary emails from people as far away as New Zealand and Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, Germany, in the UK. And I really want to thank the individuals who have written me and shared the photographs with me of the chemtrails that are being laid down in their areas. And it's the same everywhere. And you can tell that people, particularly in Europe, are very concerned about this. And I would like to congratulate them for the fact that they do have this raised awareness. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into some of these questions.
Absolutely. So if we can take a caller on the line, hopefully we'll get them on the line in a moment. Do we have a caller?
Hello.
Hello there. Hi, you're on the air with Marc McCandlish.
Hello.
Hello there.
Hello.
Caller, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Am I on?
Yes, you are. You are absolutely on. You're on the air with Roxy Lopez, and our guest is Marc McCandlish. What can we do for you?
Hi, this is Steve Mallon. How you doing?
Hi, Steve. Very well, thank you. How are you?
Pretty good. The concern of the biological aspects to this chemtrails is, they could be just laying down a lot of stuff that's just inert and just waiting for a certain time for the catalyst to make things all come into play. It's very scary. It's similar to Operation Ranch Hand in Vietnam, and yesterday I couldn't believe the bombardment I saw in the sky. It was unbelievable. I counted 12 planes in one part of the sky all over the place, just laying them down like you wouldn't believe.
Where are you located right now where you're seeing this action?
Bullhead, Laughlin.
Oh, you're in Laughlin right now, and they're getting hammered with chemtrails?
Yesterday they were, all day, up into the evening. I put some pictures on the chemtrails kill. But
do you have a question for Marc, Steve?
Oh, hi, Marc. How are you? I'm still trying to make it to Dulce, but otherwise, I think you're right on about the biological aspects of this. You just don't know, and it seems to be getting worse. Yesterday, I saw two different types of trails, two different colors, going side by side each other, two different planes. So something else is being sprayed besides the aluminum, barium, sodium stuff. So that it just worries me. Odd stuff going on. What do you think, Marc?
Well, let me just comment on that. I've noticed that phenomenon also. In fact, I saw that very thing here just a few days ago, and it's probably more a question of appearance and misidentification of what you're actually looking at. But typically, what happens on a sunny day when they begin to lay down the chemtrails, if there's already an existing haze in the air from previous aerosol campaigns, one of the things that I've noticed, a very pronounced shadow that's being cast from the chemtrails because of the concentration of chemicals in the trail itself. And so what you wind up with is the white trail from the aircraft, and then immediately next to it, seemingly appearing simultaneously with it, is a shadow that's being cast through the existing haze that's already there. So very often it does look like you have two aircraft running side by side, one spraying a white trail, and the other trail actually...
Kind of a brownish, reddish color, I guess.
Hey, Steve, it seems like wherever you're at, you're standing out in a stiff breeze because you're getting a tremendous amount of noise coming from the mic on your
Sorry, yeah. It's coming in. We're getting ready for the 40, 50 mile-an-hour winds from... whatever front's coming in. I don't see any trails out today, but anyway, it's starting to get pretty windy. I got to start putting things up.
All right. Well, thanks for calling in, and we appreciate your call. Marc, interesting that you were speaking about the gray chem. Have you noticed, and we've been seeing this, I hadn't noticed this before, but I'm seeing a clear sky, a chem plane, a chem trail following it, but then out in front of the nose, going out quite a distance, is the gray chem trail, like almost like it's coming out of the nose. What is that? Is that an optical illusion?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
In fact, I saw this for the first time around 2001, and I thought exactly what Steve was saying, was that it appeared that there were two different trails being sprayed simultaneously. And, of course, the first thing I thought of was, okay, here's the base chemical and here's the catalyst coming along right behind it as, 2 points of distribution for some kind of reaction at altitude. And it turned out, after looking through binoculars, I found that the darker so-called trail did not have an airplane in front of it. It was actually a cast shadow that was being basically cast like the striations that you see in the sunlight that comes down through the clouds, during a dramatic sunset or something. This is actually a very linear-looking shadow that's being cast by the chemtrail down through the pre-existing haze in the environment.
That's
not
interesting.
actually.
It looks so bizarre because it looks like it's actually coming out of the front of the plane, like it just isn't. It must be some kind of reflection or something, like you said. And the other thing is, we have been making some associations now with weather. The chemtrailing seems to precede some kind of weather that comes. For instance, in a nutshell, and I don't know if you're seeing it in Redding, California, and I would love to hear more about that. We're getting a lot of reports from Redding, and we can get into that, about chemtrails and about chemwebs, massive chemweb fallout. Mm-hmm. But I was going to ask you, in Arizona, for instance, we didn't see chemtrailing in the area that I'm in, which is a rural county farming community. And we hadn't seen them in a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, I want to say. And then, of course, this was during monsoon that we didn't see them. And then, of course, we didn't have any rain. And it was really interesting if you watched the Doppler radar. We'd have rain coming in from the south, let's say, or from the west, from California or from Mexico. And when it would come up through the state, the weather pattern would split off, I'm serious, right at Casa Grande. And it would just split off right there and completely go around us. And it would rain up north, and it would rain in the south. In other words, Tucson and Phoenix would get rain, and we were getting absolutely nothing. And we would be, doing the rain dance outside and the whole 9 yards. We need some rain because we had an extreme heat summer. I mean, we were just triple digits day in and day out, record breaking this year, by the way. And
now, Casa Grande, don't you have a mountain range that's just immediately to the west of your city?
Yes, there are a couple of mountain ranges actually.
Okay.
But yes, we do have one that's west. We have one that's east as well, and we have the one that's north. Okay.
Now, if you look at the geology and where the spraying occurs, here in Northern California, we see this a lot because Redding is right at the top end, the north end of what is called the Central Valley, which is a major agricultural area, some of the most fertile soil in the country. And the papers that describe the geoengineering process and how they envisioned that it would be done, if it were being done, and we know that it is being done, is that these spraying campaigns would be waged either before or slightly after areas of regional instability, which is one of the terms that they use in these technical descriptions. And an area of regional instability would typically involve a mountain range because just like when a car passes through the air, there is a certain amount of turbulence in the wake of the vehicle because of the air sort of closing in behind the shell of the vehicle as it passes. Now, of course, a mountain range is stationary, but the air is moving around it, and it's moving in a much larger volume. It's moving probably a lot less quickly than the air that circulates around a car as it cuts through the atmosphere. But you do get a region of instability breaking away, sort of like a wake separation, kind of a turbulence, like the turbulences you see in the wake of a large ship passing through the ocean. You see these irregular circulation patterns which kind of stir up the water and make it all frothy and white. Well, the same is true with the atmosphere. When you have warm, moist air coming off the Pacific Ocean and it's pushed up into a higher altitude by the mountains along the coast, that air, of course, would ordinarily be compelled to condense and release its moisture. This is why we have these wonderful redwood forests that have persisted for thousands of years along the coast of California, because this is an area where you see so much precipitation by virtue of the fact that you have this area of regional instability that forces the air up to a higher altitude where the moisture condenses, forms clouds, and it rains. Now, if you pump a lot of nucleating material like aluminum oxide, nanoparticles, barium, and strontium, which also have a certain level of reactivity. If you look up barium on Wikipedia in connection with cloud seeding operations, you'll see that barium has this ability, because of its reactivity, to actually enhance and promote and augment the process of cloud seeding. This is probably one of the reasons why it's being used. But if you go in and you cloud seed in these areas where you have this turbulence in the atmosphere because of the mountain range, you can produce a lot more condensation, a lot more clouds. You can keep a lot more moisture in play by the nucleation process rather than allowing it to condense completely and drop out as rain. You can keep it aloft much longer. Now, one of the theories that I've had was that if this process is going on worldwide, there's several things that could be happening. One is, of course, increasing the reflectivity of the atmosphere, reducing the amount of radiation reaching the soil and the surface so that you can keep global temperatures down. You can reduce temperatures. Another thing is that if you can keep a lot of the moisture that's melting off from the polar ice caps and raising the ocean levels, if you can keep that moisture in play by keeping it in the atmosphere, by producing polymers that you add to these nanoparticles that are being sprayed in the atmosphere, you can keep that moisture aloft up in the upper atmosphere. And as Michael was saying earlier, if we're seeing the levels of ozone depletion that some of the scientific studies are beginning to show, you're not going to have the degree of atmospheric protection because of the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere that once existed. And so one of the alternative ways to keep that protected layer up there is to create an artificial one. So these are things that can be done. Now, in terms of steering weather patterns, one of the things that he talked about in terms of creating high and low pressure systems, one of the ways that you can do this is by actually bombarding or painting an area with a particular kind of radio frequency or RF radiation. This is in the microwave frequency. And, of course, if you remember the old commercials for one of the audio recording companies with Ella Fitzgerald's hitting a particular note and causing a champagne glass to shatter, that's an example of hitting the resonant frequency of the object. And in the case of the glass, it stresses the glass so much that it breaks. But in the case of microscopically sized, uniformly sized nanoparticles of aluminum oxide, say that are 100 nanometers across, that particular size makes it a key component in resonating at a microwave frequency, something that you would use, say, in the broadcast of weather radar or even the HARP system up in Gakona, Alaska. Now, for those of your audience who don't know what HARP is, and the discussion of HARP has been so ubiquitous that I think that there's probably only a handful of people who don't really understand what it is, but it stands for High Altitude Active Aurora Research Project, HAARP, HAARP. And essentially what they're doing is they're taking what is called a phased array of broadcast antennas that are all laid out on a grid, and they're perfectly measured grids with each antenna at exact distances from one another. Now, phased means that you can stimulate or start the broadcast of each antenna in the group at a microscopically, in microseconds apart, so that each one fires at a specific time. And if you time the broadcast of each antenna in just the right way, you can actually get the signal that goes from that antenna. And each and every one of those antennas in the array, you can get them all to basically have their signal arrive at a distant location at exactly this precise same moment. This is what a phased array broadcast does. And so if you have 1,000 antenna and they're each broadcasting 100,000 watts of energy, you can actually have billions of watts of power arrive at a particular location simultaneously. Now, to be able to pinpoint it at one spot, you could literally bring an aircraft down out of the air. You could fry the electronics of an aircraft in the air and cause it to crash. But if you broadcast it over a wider region, a region that has already had these billions of tons of nanoparticles distributed in the atmosphere through aerosol spraying, and all these particles are all, say, 100 nanometers across, you hit that with the particular frequency that would cause nanometer particles to resonate. And those resonances begin to actually cause the aluminum oxide in the nanoparticles themselves to begin to heat up. And it wouldn't have to heat up a whole lot, maybe just to, say, 140 or 150 degrees. And that by itself is enough to raise the temperature in the environment so that the entire mass of air that's being bombarded with this RF energy to begin rising up, like in a convection, like the way the air around a candle rises up because of the higher temperature and the lower density of the air. So anyone who questions whether or not this is possible should go up on the internet and look up there was a video that was made, a story about I think the fellow's name was James Canzius or John Canzius in Florida, who was a television broadcast engineer who had a particular kind of cancer, and he found that nanoparticles of gold and carbon have this unusual ability of adhering to the abnormal cells of a cancer. And so his thinking was, if I can paint myself with a particular frequency of RF energy, and I have already consumed this liquid that has nanoparticles of gold and carbon in it that adhere specifically to the tissues of a tumor, I can actually heat up the tumor by hitting the resonant frequency of those nanoparticles and kill the tumor cells in a non-invasive process, and then the body would then come in and through the use of white blood cells absorb the necrotic tissue, and it would be taken out through the kidneys. And they've actually proven this in the environment. But imagine that you're spraying nanoparticles throughout the environment, and then you paint the environment with an RF energy signal. You can actually get the same thing to happen on a much larger scale in the atmosphere. And in so doing, you cause the air mass that is being bombarded with this energy to basically warm up dramatically. Say from, I guess in the upper atmosphere, we're looking at things something like 20 degrees below zero, and you have these particles in the atmosphere that are suddenly 150 degrees. That's a dramatic change in temperature, and of course the air will rise, and with it, it'll pull the moist air that's closer to the ground up into the atmosphere and cause the condensation of clouds. So in this way, you can create a low-pressure system. Now, by virtue of the fact that you have aluminum oxide, which is a conductor, you can dramatically raise the electrostatic potential of the atmosphere itself, which means that it'll conduct electricity, and it also creates a lot more static electricity, the kind of electricity that would culminate in the production of lightning strikes. Now, I spent, I think it was either 2008, 2009, I think it was July 31st, I was out stargazing, and I noticed that at 1 o'clock in the morning they began spraying chemtrails. And so I continued to monitor the situation. They sprayed all the way through that Friday into Saturday, all day Saturday, and into Sunday morning. By Sunday, we had the most incredible cumulonimbus thunderclouds forming to the north and to the east of Redding. And these clouds laid down over 5,000 lightning strikes, which culminated in $20 million worth of firefighting efforts throughout California. Now, if you know that these particular fires are being produced by storms that were artificially generated, you can, of course, position yourself in terms of put offers and things like that. Or let's say you're a large timber company who has not been able to access the resources that you own because of environmental lawsuits. Maybe it's a spotted owl, whatever the reason. What is the other way that you can take out the value of your resources that are being blocked, from your access by, say, a lawsuit or, by other guidelines set forth by the government, is a forest fire. And then, of course, the government will pay you millions of dollars to go in and reseed, to log out all the dead lumber and timber, which can be sold. And the EPA, of course, is going to step in, and they're going to pay you to do all of the mitigation efforts to make sure that you don't have sudden erosion, which, of course, will affect the fish and the wildlife. So you can see how these things can afford certain corporations certain advantages in terms of being able to gain access to their resources that might otherwise be blocked because of environmental lawsuits and things of that nature. It's
so they gain access to certain forest reserves that they normally wouldn't have, and like what Michael was saying earlier, they get it for pennies on the dollar after it's been destroyed as well.
Sure.
So there's now I do have a question. Just some of the reports that we have had come in, and maybe you can comment on it because you did mention this already. The static electricity, I find that very interesting because when we were getting heavily sprayed, I also noticed that everything I touched, including a plant or tree in the backyard, would shock me. And I don't know if that's coincidental.
Not.
Okay.
No, you're absolutely right.
Okay. And then when they weren't spraying, for many weeks, that occurrence just absolutely stopped. And as a matter of fact, I'm serious when I say just if I just had the palm leaf touch my arm, it literally jolted. It shocked me. And the other thing that we saw happening here in Phoenix, and you can comment on all of it, there was during monsoon, as I was saying earlier, there was no chemtrailing, none. And we had thunder and lightning, and we had no rain. But we had a lot of reports, and people actually filmed this, and we just don't know what this is, but we're, for the time being, calling it dry rain. There's no rain, yet if you watch the videos, there's something dropping into the pools. And we're watching something, and it's not a bug, and it's a lot of it. And we're also seeing residual something fall out. I don't know what it is, but like, for instance, on the lawn furniture, anything that's been exposed to the weather, we're seeing little tiny crystals that sparkle in the sunlight. That and that I have not seen for 3 years. I have not seen that until this summer, but we also have a lot of reports on that too. Is this all linked to one thing, you think? I don't know.
Well, I think that one of the things that I mentioned before was putting aluminum oxide nanoparticles inside jet fuel and actually running it through the combustion process. And I think that the chem webs that we described, the polymer fibers that are showing up, these little particulates that are falling out, the so-called dry rain, as you're mentioning. I think that what you're witnessing is the consequences of experiments that didn't quite meet the ideal criteria for whatever the application was. That is to say that the chem webs fall out of the sky because the atomization process from either the dispensing equipment on the planes, the wings, inside the engines, whatever the process may be that they're using, that they're not getting the mixture quite right, and it's not staying aloft as these ultrafine spider web like fibers, but it's actually kind of congealing into these clumpy masses. And I from our previous discussions that I've actually seen this and collected specimens myself. And so I think that, like anything, you have equipment failures, you have human error, you have meteorological conditions that may not be ideal for the use of particular materials. But I think that one of the things that you may be witnessing in the terms of the dry rain may be an occasion where the mixture of the aluminum oxide and jet fuel going into the engines reached a higher percentage level than would ordinarily be ideal for the conditions or the altitude that the aircraft was operating at. And so instead of actually vaporizing the aluminum oxide and augmenting the combustion process, that it actually began to clog things up, and that the aluminum began to melt into these fine little particles, perhaps the size of a grain of salt, rather than vaporizing and becoming like a noble gas or something, where it's a metallic gas that is, distributed evenly in the combustion process, that the aluminum is actually condensing out into little salt grain particle-sized, particles that are falling out of the atmosphere. So that may be what it'd be very interesting to see if someone was able to collect specimens, because otherwise,
yes, someone has.
Okay, good.
Yeah, Caroline Carter noticed it in Cyprus, the city, the country of Cyprus, and so she has collected it, and very interesting. We're working on that as well. What she's finding, it's like I don't want to quote her at the moment because I don't have all the data and I haven't written it up yet, but we will be speaking to her on the air about it. But it's like a nano. Under the microscope, it looks like they're hollow, and
really?
it's bizarre, and they refract light, of course, but she thought it was like a salt as well. And but
you realize, of course, that barium strontium in the form that they're using in these chemtrails are in their salt form.
Right, exactly, and that's what it appears to look like. And by the way, we're seeing these salts, if you will, started about 10 days ago. I've been photographing it. It's just showing up all over on the tops of soil now, all over the community where I live. Like you can pick it up with your hand, and
really leaching out of the soil like
it is. It's leaching out. Correct. It's leaching out of the soil. And as far as the studies with the you just mentioned as well, the chem webs. That's Mike Murphy and I had also spoken about that, and he has a very similar take on it that you do, that maybe some mixture that's gone south or whatever, and we are looking into it regardless, because if these webs did come out of a plane, at least we can start identifying what was the mixture, or parts of the mixture. But what we're also finding out with the chem web is that there's been a discovery, and I believe it was Carnicom who first discovered it, and we're looking into this further, is that this material, whatever it is actually hollow, and we're looking at the idea that it may perhaps be a carrier, which would, if indeed it was a carrier, then the next question would be a carrier for what? But if you go back a year to the study that we did with Caroline Carter when we collected our first web, she had tested it and it grew a Morgellons fiber, this ChemWeb material, right, which also goes with, get this, Marc, the rainwater samples. I've now partnered with John White of the project, Chemtrails, and we have been sending water and webs in for testing, and rainwater is growing a blue fiber, and that blue fiber translates to GMO. That is exactly what a Morgellons fiber is, genetically modified organism. So what is all that going on? I mean, we're having a lot of different directions you see, and then that leads us back to, if you will, then are they purposely spraying GMO as well? I mean, this is just hypothetical. I don't know. We haven't proven it. I don't know.
Well, it seems clear to me that if what you're saying is true, that if there's a biological element to what is being sprayed, that it would definitely qualify under the bioweapons clause of Title 50 United States Code. This is something that has to be disclosed to the Department of Health and Human Services for the United States government. And I think that anyone with the funding, because when you do make a Freedom of Information Act request, you also have to stipulate that you're willing to pay the cost to task the copying of the documents that would disclose the information that you're seeking, and sometimes it can be tens of thousands of dollars. And so this is the one drawback of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, because you find that you may rightfully demand access to the information as long as it's something that is not considered classified, and yet if and when they're willing to give it to you, they're going to demand payments, something 10 or 20 cents a page. If it's 1,000 pages, you can see how that can easily run into a lot of money, the kind of money that the average citizen is not going to have available for these.
But if we collectively did it and raised the money to do it, we could actually do it. And Marc, is there any specific way to that we have to fill out this information for the Freedom of Information Act? Is there?
There's actually a website that you can go to. There's a website that you can go to if you look up Freedom of Information Act filing as a Google search or a Yahoo search or one of the other search engines. You will find a website that will give you a complete explanation of what it is that you need to do, and basically you have to specify what the information is that you're looking for, what the statutes are that govern the information that you're seeking. And in this case, if your listeners go up on the web and they look up chemical and biological weapons statutes, or Title 50 United States Code, which would just be USC in initials, you will actually find the actual statutes, and it very specifically outlines what the chain of custody is for the information, who needs to be told and when, how far in advance they need to be informed of these operations. Now, the linchpin of all this is whether or not these operations are actually government-sponsored operations, because if these are things that are being done by corporations at the behest of the government, it may not be possible to get copies of the documents.
Right.
But at the same time, if there are corporations that are out there spraying chemical and biological agents over the population, this, of course, would be a violation of the treaties governing chemical and biological weapons dispensation over populated areas. So one way or the other, they have to be answerable, at the very least, to the Department of Justice and possibly to the judiciary of the United States government. So one way or the other, you have to formulate sort of a plan of attack, if you will, for figuring out who's doing it, and we still don't really know for sure who it is. We have some ideas because we can track who the manufacturers of the nanoparticles are. In fact, I think I sent you a copy just the other day. This is sort of the sort of pervasive nature of Google and looking at the conversations that you have in your emails. So you and I have corresponded on Gmail for months, and just the other day I got a letter, a solicitation letter from a nanoparticle manufacturer in China saying, we understand that you have a great interest in aluminum oxide nanoparticles, and we're prepared to send you a high volume of nanoparticle materials at a discount price. And I thought, my God, it was just like that. Boom, they're ready to jump in and get into it commercially with me, and they don't even know a thing about me. It's startling.
Isn't that something? And back to the Freedom of Information Act, Marc, I'm wondering, it appears that the aerosol programs as a whole is a covert operation. So I would imagine that that's classified and we're not going to be able to get information. I'm not trying to doubt this, that we could get information, but is it possible that anything that was a part of that agenda, any corporations, any manufacturers, is it possible that we just wouldn't get any information whatsoever? Well,
I think that one of the things that corporations, and of course the United States government technically is a corporation itself, I think one of the things that they like to fall back on when they are doing things that the public may not be happy about is the policy of so-called plausible deniability.
Yes.
The problem is that they're exercising, or I should say, they're performing these operations in plain sight. And I've talked to my neighbors. They see me standing in my driveway with these huge binoculars. And what are you looking at? And I said, well, can't you see? And oh, those are just contrails. What are you talking about? I said, no, seriously. Look at that plane over there. See the little short trail behind it? That's a contrail. See the thing that goes from horizon to horizon? That's a chemtrail. That's something else. It's an entirely different animal. Oh, you can't be serious. I said, no, I actually am. I can show you the science papers that show what they're doing and why. So it's raising public awareness like we're trying to do right now that's going to start to make the difference, I believe. But whether or not you'll actually be able to get them to disclose something how many photographs have you and I traded of these kinds of things happening over the area where you live and the area where I live, and how people can go through their day-to-day routine and not notice this kind of stuff, not notice that their kids are coughing or noticing that awful metallic taste in their mouth when they see these things overhead. How people are not noticing this. I have friends that have respiratory problems, and I keep saying to them, have you ever noticed that there's a coincidence between when these things are appearing in the sky overhead and when you're having problems breathing? And most of them have to admit that, yes, they're seeing an increased incidence of breathing and respiratory problems In fact, I think one of the things that first really brought this to my attention was either 2000 or 2001. I noticed, these unusual trails overhead being sprayed by the airplane, and it was 1 or 2 days later, the headline on the Reading Record Searchlight here in town was, dozens of patients admitted to area hospitals complaining of respiratory distress. And I thought, holy smokes, could it be? And that was when I started looking at it. And it was, even my girlfriend has said that she has noticed on the days when these trails seem to be appearing more often that there's this strange metallic taste that she gets in her mouth right from the air. And it's a fairly common complaint. So, it doesn't seem to me that they can deny it's going on. I think what would really be helpful is if we could hire a plane to go up with some kind of collection device and fly up through the chemtrails and see what we could actually collect in the way of the chemicals or polymers, whatever it is that's coming out of those planes.
Mark, you and I have talked about that, and many activists have talked about this, and nobody's actually done it. To my knowledge, there's nobody that's actually done it. Is there a way, do you know anyone that would participate in this? We've really gone, we don't, but people think we're crazy when we write into them and ask them if they'd even be willing to do such a thing, because there are weather modification companies that actually offer that service. Did you know that?
Well, that's just it. I have a friend who's fairly wealthy who has actually offered to sponsor something like that, but that has been the sort of the $24,000 question is who has the equipment and an aircraft that is capable of collecting those kinds of specimens, those kind of samples, and I, as you rightly point out, I think there are companies that are able to do that, and they're the very companies who seem to be responsible for spraying the trails.
Well, and that's interesting because I've written a few companies, one being Weather Modification, Inc., and do you know that these people will not return my phone calls and they will not return an email because I'm not a corporation. I think they won't even return a phone call. If I'm and yet you're getting spammed by China to purchase large amounts of nanoparticles.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? It is kind of strange. And as far as getting somebody to go up there, I think that between us all, like with Dane Wigington and Francis and Mike Murphy and the rest of all of our camps down White, I think, and yourself, of course, I think that we could devise, and Clifford Carnicom, I think we could devise, if we could get the plane, I think we could actually devise something that we can, like a little vacuum in the plane or something that we can vacuum up. You know what I mean? That's how I see it in my mind. There are systems that have been designed. Or just look at the systems that these weather modification companies are selling, or they charge you like $10,000 to go up and test precipitation and so forth for farmers and this and that. So why can't we do it? Let's do it.
Sure. Yeah, it's just a matter of expense. That's really all it is. But I do think that there is a means for doing that. I think that if you are in the business of weather modification, or if you are in the business of helping to produce rain so that crops will have the water they need, then you also probably need to have some means of analyzing the results of whatever it is you're doing, or whatever the conditions are in the atmosphere of the area that you intend to modify. So it occurs to me that anyone who's involved in that kind of research or active weather modification would probably have to have those kinds of systems in order to be able to document whatever it was that they claimed they were doing to the environment that would augment or somehow enhance the ability of the local system to produce rain.
Absolutely. There's record of it. Absolutely. I agree. By the way, Mark, I don't know how this happened, but we're winding down the show already. We've got 10 minutes left of the show, and that really went by so fast. It just always does. There's just so much to cover. I always feel like, oh, no, I missed 10 things I want to talk about. But I was going to ask you, is there at the forefront of your mind right now the most important part of this awareness campaign, et cetera? What would you say is, Michael had his comments of what he is doing. What would you say as well that you have been doing to create awareness, other than, obviously coming on my radio show for sure, but what are other ways that you would suggest to the general public, to the listeners, that they could help to create more awareness?
Well, in just about every area of this country, and I'm sure in other countries, there are talk radio programs where people have discussions, whether it's National Public Radio, whether it's just a local station that has a couple of people come on in the morning before somebody like Rush Limbaugh or someone comes on the air. And I would encourage your listeners to call the local stations, to call even some of the better known national hosts like George Norrie or Jerry Pippin or Howard Axtell or Ken McCormick or any of the folks that you know of that have programs that talk about these things, and encourage them to have a discussion on the air about the topic, to encourage people to call in and express their feelings. Because I think that when you are able to do that, you're able to expand the awareness even further, exponentially, because if you can get more and more people to listen, they're talking about the stupid chemtrails again. What? These people are nuts. They don't know what they're talking about. But the more people that listen, they say, no, wait a minute. I mean, there's some real science behind what's being discussed here. I mean, they're talking about papers, research papers that you can find on the Internet. If you plug in just the right search terms when you're using one of those search engines, toxicological effects of aluminum oxide nanoparticles, stock investment in nanoparticle technology, nanoparticle research, the HARP program, all of these different things, the John Canzius business that I was talking about earlier. I mean, there's so many different applications of nanoparticle technology, and yet the one that seems to be most pervasive, the one that seems to be most harmful, is the one that's right in plain sight, right over our heads, that no one seems to have any awareness of. And it's in having discussions like this one here, and I appreciated so much you're having Michael Murphy on earlier, because he is one of the real champions of this cause. This is how you raise public awareness. People sending emails to their friends. Take some pictures, with your digital camera, put them on a website, put them on Facebook, talk to your friends. Get them to look up and just say, hey, look, see the difference between that one there, the real short trail that's right behind the plane, and the one that goes from horizon to horizon. This is the way that you raise public awareness. And so I have no doubt that if people begin to write their senators and their congressmen to complain about what they think is happening, there'll probably be a blanket denial. But I think if enough people begin to complain and they show some of the analysis of the soil, like Francis Mangels has done here in Northern California. The amount of aluminum in the water that's coming off of Mount Shasta, the symbol for Shasta Cola, by the way. The water there has almost 60,000 times the normal amount of aluminum in the water from these chemtrails. And people actually, when they climb the mountain, they drink the water from the snow melt, and they think, this is pure spring water, it's pure snow melt, and it's anything but. It's loaded with these metals, and it can harm you. And this is getting into the aquifers. It's getting into the plants. One of the discussions we had during a previous broadcast was the fact that the aluminum oxide, when it gets into the soil and gets into the plants, particularly in the forest, that aluminum oxide is still there with all of its combustibility. This is one of the reasons why the big fire down in southeastern Arizona earlier this year was almost impossible to put out, because it delivers the same added amount of oxygen to the forest fire as you would see when it's burning in a high-temperature thermate explosive, or as, a component in rocket propellant or jet fuel. It introduces so much oxygen into the combustion of the forest that these forest fires burn intensely hot and are almost impossible to extinguish. And of course that jeopardizes the lives of all the firefighters and anyone who's in the path of the fire. The idea that we lost 1,000 square miles of forest this last year in that one fire, this is unprecedented.
Right. Yes, it is unprecedented, and it's interesting because you and I had been involved in some letter writing at the time, and as many of our listeners did. And we've got the United States and Arizona is home to the Evergreen supertanker, which is totally I've got it in writing from Steve Daniels. They could have at 100,000 acres they could have put the fire out under 2 days, and yet our governor wouldn't budge on that. No one would budge on that. No one would allow them. There was a letter campaign that went out to our governor and even the President of the United States of America, and that fire was never touched by the Evergreen supertanker. But let's see how this all plays out as well. Why in the world would a $100 million supertanker not be able to put, as Steve Daniels had said, we're 20 minutes from the fire. What's the problem? Yeah.
This is for the people listening in the audience, the supertanker that Roxy's talking about is a converted 747 airframe that has a huge sausage-shaped section that has been fabricated into the structure of the aircraft to allow it to hold a tremendous capacity of retardant for firefighting potential, for the capability of dropping a tremendous amount of retardant. In our area, it's almost laughable, if it wasn't so pathetic, that we have a 65 or 70-year-old four-engine, propeller-driven seaplane from the 1940s that comes in and lands on the big reservoir up here behind Shasta Dam, fills its belly with water, and then lifts off the water, flies out and drops that combined with retardant on the forest fires. And it's doing it as an effective job as anything else that they've got out there. The helicopters with one bucket of water underneath them, or the C-130s that we see occasionally from the California Department of Forestry and Firefighting. But to have a plane like a 747, which, granted, it doesn't have the maneuverability that a smaller plane like the C-130 has, but the capacity for being able to drop tremendous volumes of water and retardant is unsurpassed by any other system. Even the Russians have developed a dedicated platform for this kind of firefighting, and it's been offered to the United States government, to California, and it's been flatly refused. So you have to wonder why.
Exactly.
Why are they not allowing it to be done?
And that's a good question, and that's a good way to actually end the show. We'll have to continue to learn more about that, Marc. We will, The Truth and I will be making a video of the radio show as we have done with you before, and we'll have some contact information for Marc McCandlish for the listeners, and you can write Marc, and Marc has answered many questions from the listeners before, and we certainly appreciate that too. And Marc, I want to personally thank you for taking the time out today to join us for a very, very important show. You and Michael Murphy broke the record, and by the way, the last hour of the show, the listenership and chat doubled again. So this is the biggest show. Obviously, what it says to me, Marc, is that people are waking up, people are concerned, and I wouldn't have it any other way than to have you and Michael on the show to explain exactly what's been going on in our skies and these aerosol programs. So I can't thank you enough, and I'm sure that we'll be speaking soon to do some letter writing, and perhaps in the future maybe you and I can talk about a company called ArborGen, which is a genetically modified seed forestation company. So anyway, Marc, thanks so much for coming.
Well, you're welcome, Roxy. I really appreciate you having me back. It's as always, it's a great pleasure. You're a terrific host, and I look forward to the next occasion when we'll be able to talk.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks so much, Marc, and we'll let you go for now. Thank you. And listeners, that was Marc McCandlish, and another amazing show. Because of you, we have broken so many records today. It's amazing. I didn't even think about that. And thank you to the GIC for letting us know that we had broken all the records today for the GIC network. And that's absolutely amazing. And it goes to show you people are waking up. I want to remind you that the Just Bernard show is on Mondays, and this Monday, Bernard's guest is going to be Jeff Harvey, and he's going to be sharing some new findings on radionics and alien contact technology. So that sounds very, very fascinating, very interesting. I'm sure going to listen to it if I have the time. If not, we can always listen and download the show 10 minutes after it's over. Again, I want to thank the listening audience for your dedication and your time. I want to add that the Truth Denied website is literally on fire. Please go to the front page because Michael Murphy's new promo, Why in the World Are They Spraying, is located there. Also, you'll see some icons, collect a web or collect a rainwater sample. If you just click that icon, and they're very large, so they're very easy to see, it will give you the instructions on what to do, and you will be immediately put in contact with Chemtrails Project, John White. John White heads the Chemtrails Project, and we have partnered with John to get more evidence. Again, we're going to have some reports on Arborgen next week and the genetically modified organism forests and what that's all about. We're going to talk about more on the stock market plays and something that is called cat bond, CAP, cat bond. That stands for catastrophe bond. Yes, folks, you can buy catastrophe bonds. And what does that say? I think Michael Murphy is right on target. I want to thank you for another amazing Friday. I thank my guest, Marc McCandlish, Michael Murphy. And, of course, I am the host of the Truth Denied Talk Radio. Please join us again next week. High noon in the desert, as usual. Be safe. Keep up the good work, people.
GIC Radio presents The Truth Denied Talk Radio with your host, Roxy Lopez, where truth never lies. If you would like to speak with Roxy on the air, the call-in number is 347-327-9997. Here she is, your host, Roxy Lopez.
Welcome to the Truth Denied Radio. I'll be your host, Roxy Lopez. Today is Friday, the 18th of November, and we have a very special guest for you today. I know that a lot of you have been writing in about Marc McCandlish. Marc is just an absolutely amazing encyclopedia, if you will. And you all know it. I know that you really look forward. You had a lot of questions for Marc today, and we will get to those questions. Marc doesn't even need an introduction at this point. He is family to the Truth Denied Talk Radio. So without any further ado, let's just bring Marc McCandlish on. Welcome to the show, Marc.
Thank you, Roxy. Appreciate you having me back.
Absolutely. Now, Marc, you know, we've been inside of some discussions, and for the listening audience, let's just start right at the beginning here with your observation of what's going on in the skies. What is a chemtrail? What is geoengineering all about? What is your understanding at this point?
Well, chemtrails, for anyone who hasn't actually noticed what's going on in the skies, are these trails being left by jet aircraft flying at altitude that stretch from horizon to horizon and persist for hours, in most cases spreading out and eventually becoming either a white haze or contributing to the formation of clouds. They're distinguished from conventional condensation trails, or contrails as they're more commonly called, which are nothing more than moisture condensing on the hot exhaust gases from the jet engines as they fly at altitude. Now, this is sort of an industrial scale version of what happens when you're out on a cold day and you exhale and you see your breath. It's the same kind of process where the temperature difference between the air that you're exhaling from your lungs is much warmer than the cold, moist air around you. And so the water, the moisture, the humidity in the air condenses because of the hot gases, or the relatively warmer gases that come out of your lungs. Of course, the jet engine produces much higher temperatures, somewhere around 1,500 degrees, I guess. So when you see a conventional contrail, it usually is, probably 20 times the length of the aircraft that's producing it, sometimes a little bit longer. An aircraft flying at altitude, if you were to look up and put your hand out at arm's length and sort of measure the length of a conventional contrail for an aircraft that's flying, say, at 20 to 25,000 feet, would probably be 5 to 6 inches in length on a ruler held at arm's length. But the chemtrails involve the dispensing of microscopically fine, evenly sized nuclei, little tiny used, the same kinds of materials that are used in chemtrailing. Now, the reason that is significant is because just like these, just in the last month or so, there's been at least one major grain silo explosion where people were actually killed or injured. And you may not understand the link between those two things, but what happens is when you have something that is combustible, and aluminum oxide is something that contributes greatly to a combustion process because it introduces so much oxygen to the chemical reaction. But if you take something like grain dust that's evenly distributed through the atmosphere, it's a fine particle, it's combustible. If there's any kind of a spark or an ignition that occurs, because of the fine particulation of the material, the combustion reaction spreads through the environment much faster than it ordinarily would. And so this is what causes the explosion. It's basically like a flame front that rips through the inside of the combustion chamber of your car's engine, except on a much, much larger scale. And, of course, it can completely blow the buildings apart. And this is what has happened, is what killed these people. But if you take that same kind of material and you introduce it into jet fuel, now, and there's actually been studies done where they were using up to 40% by weight in the jet fuel for some of these jet aircraft that are flying at altitude, that the aluminum oxide introduces so much oxygen into the reaction that it not only enhances the combustion process, it raises the temperatures, but because of its fine size, its fine particulate size, there's no erosion of the turbine blades in the compressor section or the combustion section of the jet engines, but it speeds up the combustion reaction, makes it more efficient, so you get higher efficiency, more thrust from the jet engine, and so you get your fuel costs are reduced because 40% of what you're actually burning is a solid aluminum oxide material, albeit very, very fine particulation. So, this is one of the things that may be responsible for, the chemtrails, is the fact that they're looking for ways to fly these aircraft more economically. And in my area, I went out and bought a very large set of binoculars from a sporting goods store, the 80 by 20, I think they are. And, you can see that many of the planes that are laying down these chemtrails are actually painted in the livery of a number of airlines, and most particularly here in this area is Southwest Airlines, sort of an orange, red, and blue paint scheme with these stripes and things that go down the side of the plane. But I've also seen on several occasions the 747 laying down chemtrails. It was sprayed in the blue over white livery of KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. So, it appears at least that if these are not actually commercial airliners, that many of the aircraft that are dispensing these chemtrails are painted to look as though they are commercial airliners. But I think the main thing that I want to point out was that the aluminum oxide, when it comes out of the exhaust, it goes into the environment, and when it gets into the environment, it either stays there, depending on how much of these other lofting polymers are included in the exhaust stream, that contribute to keeping these particles airborne as long as possible, or they begin to settle out in this form of a kind of a white haze. In our area, when I first moved up here in the early 1990s, you could look 60, 70 miles away and see Mount Lassen as clear as a bell with a beautiful blue sky. But starting around 2000 or 2001, I began to notice these trails overhead that would persist for hours, and then in the wake of those trails having been dispensed, that you would begin to see this white haze that would settle over the area. Now, that's really kind of separate and apart, distinguished from the kind of air pollution that you would see like in the Phoenix or Los Angeles area or Mexico City or Rome, places like that where you have a tremendous volume. I had one day where from the crack of dawn, between 7 and 9 a.m., there were literally hundreds of chemtrails that were being dispensed over this area. And this seemed to be right in the area ahead of an incoming storm front that was coming down out of the Gulf of Alaska. And in fact, this is probably the tail end of the storm that you and I are going to talk about a little bit later, that actually had an effect on one of your family members, who was up on a fishing boat in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Now, how long do you think that this program has been going on, geoengineering and aerosol spraying? I mean, in your best estimation, how long do you think that we've been actually been having this impact?
Well, there've been studies that were conducted all the way back in the 1950s, 1960s about the possibility of seeding clouds by putting silver iodide and other kinds of materials into the clouds. The idea that you can actually make a change to the environment by putting certain materials into the air has been known for quite some time. I mean, they've even found that by seeding the oceans with fine particulate of iron, that they can dramatically boost the production of algae, so essentially fertilization of the oceans. And that algae then in turn will produce tremendous amounts of oxygen, because they're like microscopically sized plants, so they take in carbon dioxide and they're producing oxygen in exchange during that process. So it's one way that's been looked at, doing things like what you hear more often now is carbon dioxide sequestration. So they've known for quite some time that you could do this, but if you get up on the internet and you begin looking at all of the different research and the studies and the peer-reviewed papers that have been published that describe some of the processes that we now see actively being undertaken in the air over our heads, you'll find that not only were major corporations looking at ways to do this, but even the military has explored what the consequences would be health-wise to people who were exposed to nanoparticle materials. Now, the significance of nanoparticles is that if you can take a a material such as aluminum oxide, which has 1 atom of aluminum and 3 atoms of oxygen, and you take that material and you are able to produce it in large quantities, that would be one thing. But being able to control the actual size of the particles down to a very specific dimension, say 40 to 100 nanometers across, that is a significant development that has been seeing great strides in advancement over the last decade or so. And now there are a number of companies around the world that are producing millions of tons of this all the time. If you look at the stock market and how these particular areas of technology are seeing greater and greater levels of investment in the billions of dollars, you can see that the production levels of this are going up. And it's not just because they're using it to produce explosives, and you'll find that this material, if you look up, say, thermate or thermite, super thermite explosives, the kinds of explosives that are used in the controlled demolition of buildings and in high explosive materials used by the military, you'll find that these materials are volume of card sauce is producing kind of a brownish gray smog. This is a pure white haze, and it's not the kind of thing that you see because of added humidity. When you see higher humidity in the air, it tends to be kind of a bluish haze, a bluish gray. But this is obviously something different. It's something that's being put into the environment, and it's showing up in the water. It's showing up in the water analysis that has been done by a number of people up here in Northern California. They're seeing a dramatic change in the alkalinity of the soil. We're seeing a die-off of the invertebrates in the streams and the lakes that support the fish population, so we're seeing a reduction in the fish, the number of fish. We've seen a dramatic drop in the number of amphibians. One of the things that you typically find in Northern California are what they call vernal or seasonal ponds, with everything from mosquito larvae to fairy shrimp, which is a protected species, but also tremendous populations of tree frogs and other kinds of amphibians. And these populations have been absolutely devastated. And it appears that this has a lot to do with the aluminum oxide, barium, and strontium fallout that's coming from the chemtrails.
Now, Marc, what's your opinion on, secret biological chemicals being tested on the public? Is that even possible? Or, in other words, what is the agenda for the aerosol spraying?
Well, I'm sure that it's possible to make a connection between one and the other. I mean, you can come to the conclusion that this may be a form of biological warfare. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are chemical and biological warfare statutes that are on the books and have been for decades under Title 50 United States Code. I think it's Section 1512, if I'm not mistaken, that essentially says that in any instance where intentionally or unintentionally chemicals or biological weapons of any kind, whether it's some kind of germ warfare or something that affects the biology of the environment or the people living there, that the Department of Health and Human Services for the United States government needs to be given advance notice, as do the governors of each of the individual states where these kinds of things are going on. So they're as long as it's something that's being perpetrated by the government itself or one of their government or defense contractors that are under government contract, there has to be a paper trail. There has to be acknowledgement, something that can be found under the Freedom of Information Act. But I haven't seen any evidence that there is an acknowledgement of what's going on. And this is what's so disturbing, because it actually seems to be something that's being perpetrated by corporations in specific areas. We've had discussions in the past about some of the aircraft that appear to be flying out of bases or airports that are operated by a particular company with a name that refers to a particular kind of conifer, and it's it's the kind of thing that really makes you wonder to see something that has been perpetrated on the kind of scale that we're talking about here has to involve billions upon billions of dollars, not only in the investment of equipment, the modification of aircraft, recruiting the pilots that are going to fly these things, and then establishing some kind of a system worldwide that would allow for the control and dispensing of these materials in particular areas. This last week, when these hundreds of chemtrails were being dispensed here in Northern California, I have particles in many cases of three different kinds of metals that we see more commonly than anything else. So the first and foremost is aluminum oxide. Second is, I believe it's barium. And the third one that we see in the least amount of quantities among the three is strontium. Now, there are some isotopes of barium and strontium that have a certain amount of radioactivity, but it doesn't appear that these particular particles have really any seriously measurable level of radioactivity. But they do have a certain level of reactivity with the moisture in the atmosphere, and that is that's the main issue, is what it does when it's in the air. You put a number in the billions of particles into the atmosphere, and you produce them, distribute them into the environment at a higher temperature, and of course they attract the humidity in the environment, and they condense, and they begin to form ice crystals or condensation into water droplets. It accelerates the process of condensation. So it's very much like cloud seeding, but there's an eventually situation where these materials will ordinarily fall out either with the precipitation that's formed and eventually becomes a cloud or storms, or there are other things that can be done to continue to keep those particles aloft, one of which is a series of patents that have been found that talk about a particular kind of polymer material that's mixed in with these fluids that are dispensed out of the aircraft, either through the jet exhaust or from the wings, that actually absorb the solar radiation from the heat of the sun, and they're able to, basically they're self-lofting materials that will allow this polymer to stay up in the upper areas of the atmosphere for days, weeks, and in some cases the claims have been for up to a year. So these materials, once they're put in the atmosphere, are obviously going to have some kind of an effect. First and foremost appears to be an impact on the amount of solar radiation that reaches the surface. If you can reflect that away from the surface, if you can control the degree of solar radiation that reaches the surface, you can not only control how much sunlight an area will get, you can control the temperatures of the geology in that area. You can even control how much sunlight a crop is receiving from the sun. And so in so doing, you can alter the temperature of the environment. And, of course, everybody who's ever really looked at weather and what happens with weather knows that if you have a relatively cold environment, that the air isn't as excited because there isn't much heat, so the air tends to contract, and that contraction can basically pull more air into that area. You can actually sequentially seed areas or blanket areas with chemtrails and actually divert the course of the jet stream, which is one of the primary moving forces both in the north and the southern hemispheres for major weather patterns. And if you can do that, then you can divert the course of storms. And if you can control the course of storms, then of course you can actually influence where precipitation falls or where it does not fall, and you can have some serious impacts across the entire face of the planet.
Which we're probably seeing right now.
Well, it sure looks that way. I mean, I live up here in Northern California in the community of Redding, which is about a little over 2 hours by car north of Sacramento. And just in the last week, we